Hello, friends. We're here together today to do a read aloud together. So, the book we're going to read is called Drawn Together. And before we begin, we're going to do two things today. First, we're going to ask a good reader question that will help us better able to connect to the characters in this book. And then we're going to talk about the genre of this book. Then we'll check in on the front cover and begin. So, the good reader question that will help you better able to connect to the characters is this. How do you feel when you first meet someone or spend time with someone who you don't know that well? How do you feel when you spend time with someone that you don't know that well? I know for me, when I'm spending time with someone I don't know that well, I really want them to feel comfortable. So I act extra friendly, asking lots of questions and making sure to be really interested in what they say. That just feels important to me to make that person feel comfortable. So what do? How do you feel in your brain, your heart, and your body when you spend time with someone you don't know that well? When you're able, pause this video and talk to someone near you about what you do when you spend time with someone that you don't know that well. Great. Thinking about how your brain and heart and body handle that moment will help you better able to connect to the characters in this story, Drawn Together. Now, the genre of Drawn Together is a fiction story. Fiction means that the author wrote it in order to tell us a story. We know that a fiction story is going to have characters and setting. There's going to be a problem that gets solved. It might follow the somebody wanted but so then structure. And Drawn Together is a fiction story. Let's move to the front cover and check in. I've done some research on these characters, so I know some things about their identities. I know a bit about their family identity. I can tell you that this is a grandfather and this is a grandson, that they're in a family together. And that also tells us a little bit about their age identities, that grandfather is older, an elder, and that grandson is a kid. I can also tell you a little bit about their language identities. Grandson speaks English. Grandfather speaks a different language that is not English. The author doesn't tell us exactly which language it is, but we know that grandfather speaks a different language that is not English. So let's begin. Drawn Together by Min Lei and illustrated by Dan Santat. And I want to tell you two things about this book before we start. First is that this book is a book that uses a lot of illustrations and not that many words. So I'm going to be telling you what I'm thinking about a lot as we read it to help put the story together. And the second thing is that as we've been practicing Venn diagrams, when we finish this story, we're going to use a Venn diagram to compare Drawn Together to a different text by comparing it and contrasting it. So you might think about text-to-text connections you're having along the way to help support you in finishing your Venn diagram. Let's begin. Drawn Together by Min Lei and illustrated by Dan Santat. So I can see in these opening illustrations that there's grandson ringing the doorbell and that grandfather answers the door. I see that they're clasping their hands together and bowing, waving goodbye to the adult who's driving in that car, and then entering the house together. It seems like grandson is visiting grandfather alone, that no one else is coming with him. And grandfather's face, I notice, looks in the yellow. He's really excited about this visit. Grandson, he looks more in the blue. He looks kind of skeptical. Skeptical's a feeling when you're not sure what's going to happen and you're not sure if you like it. Next, I notice that they're having a meal together. They're sharing a meal, but I notice that they're eating different things. I know this is grandfather because I see the red sleeves, and it looks like he's eating noodles or ramen of some kind. And grandson is having a hot dog with fries and a salad. I also noticed that grandfather is using chopsticks to eat his meal, and grandson's using a fork. Oh, here the author's included some speech bubbles. Grandson's saying, "So, what's new, Grandpa?" And Grandpa answers him in a language that is not English, and I don't know how to read this language. I'm not an expert in reading or speaking it, but I do see a question mark at the end, so I do see grandfather asking grandson a question. But these series of periods mean that no one's answering. That means that they can't speak to each other. I wonder if it's hard that they have so many things about them that are different. It seems like it's making it hard for them to connect. And that makes sense, especially if you don't speak the same language. It would be hard to connect with each other. Now I notice that they're watching TV, but Grandpa's also watching grandson. Looks a little bit worried. Again, I see grandfather asking a question in the language that he speaks with a question mark at the end, and grandson asking, "Can we watch something else?" But again, they're not able to communicate because they don't understand each other. Oof. Even grandfather, who was in the yellow about this visit at the beginning of the story, he's starting to feel blue and bored. They both look a little bored now. I wonder if it's because he's bored that grandson gets up from the couch Looks like he gets his backpack and he gets out some art materials. I notice grandfather's wondering what he's doing, and I know that because of a question mark. The authors included question marks over grandfather's head because he's curious. He's wondering what grandson is doing. And it looks like grandson's drawing. I notice he's drawing something that almost looks like him, but he's added some important details. He's added like a wizard cap and a cape and a wand. Wow, and this makes grandfather really excited. He's in the yellow again when he sees the boy's art materials. I wonder why that made him feel yellow. I notice he's brought back his own art materials. And again, they're a little bit different than what the boy's using, but they are art materials. I know that because it's a sketch pad and he has a well of ink and also a paintbrush. And here the authors included some words that tell us what grandson is thinking in his head. It says, right when I gave up on talking, my grandfather surprised me by revealing a world beyond words. That means that they're communicating now, but not with words, but rather using art to communicate to each other. And in a flash, we see each other for the first time. Wow, okay, so now we know grandfather is an artist too. They have that in common and are making a connection to each other. Even though the way they draw is different, it's art that connects them together. So they've both done sort of self-portraits with small changes, right? The grandson has used markers to do a self-portrait where he's a sort of wizard, and grandfather has used a paintbrush and ink to do a self-portrait where he's also a kind of warrior. All the things we could never say come pouring out. And we build a new world that even words can't describe. I hear the author telling us that even though they still have different language identities and they can't communicate with words, they're using art to tell a story together, to connect and communicate. But just when we're closer than ever, that old distance comes roaring back. I hear the author describing that there's still different identities that they have and that sometimes that might make it feel like they can't connect. But this time, I'm not afraid. And I noticed something important on this page. On grandfather's side of the cliff, he has the boy's wand. And on grandson's side of the cliff, he has the grandfather's paintbrush. I notice they've picked up each other's art materials, and it's changing the way their self-portraits look just a little bit. They're inspired by each other, and they've changed each other's art. I know that together, we can make our way across. Now, after years of searching for the right words, we find ourselves happily speechless. And speechless is a word that means you're not saying anything. This is a very green and loving moment in illustration. Even though they'll always have many identities that are different about them, grandson and grandfather know that they will always be able to connect using art. And here in the background, we can see all the illustrations they made together that told that story that connected them. Here you see the adult has arrived again to pick grandson up. But I noticed something important. Even as grandson leaves grandfather's house, he has the paintbrush, and grandfather has kept the marker. Traded art materials. And that's your good reader question today. Why do you think that grandfather and grandson traded art materials? Why'd they do that? What made them decide to do that? Think about it and answer it using evidence from the books. Remember that a good reader will say, grandfather and grandson traded art materials because, and I know that when the author wrote or the illustrator drew. So pause this video if you're able and talk to someone near you about why you think grandfather and grandson traded art materials. Great. I wonder what you came up with. For me, I think grandfather and grandson traded art materials because they were inspired by each other's styles, because they changed the way each other drew by learning from each other. And I think that because the illustrator drew this illustration where when they connected again across the bridge, it was because the grandson had the paintbrush and grandfather had the marker or the wand. And that changed the way their self-portraits look, that grandson had become black and white and grandfather had become in color. So that's why I think they traded art materials. I wonder what you came up with. The last thing we're going to do today is use a I say, you say, Venn diagram to compare and contrast drawn together with another book. So remember that compare means finding the things about two books that are the same, and we put those things that are the same in the space where the two circles overlap. And contrast means finding things about two books that are different, and we put the things that are different in the spaces of the circles that are separate. So you could compare and contrast drawn together with really any story as long as you can think of comparisons and contrasts that make sense. But I thought today I would compare drawn together with the book Cora Cook's Ponset. So I'm going to take a moment to get an art material, and I'm going to write drawn together over one part of the Venn diagram and Cora Cook's Ponset over the other part of the Venn diagram. Your job is to write drawn together over one part of the Venn diagram and whichever book you want to use to compare and contrast with over the other. If you want to join me using Cora Cook's Ponset, that's fine, but if your brain doesn't remember that story very well, or your brain thought of other text-to-text connections while reading drawn together, it would be okay to do a different book too. So for me, I'm going to model Cora Cook's Ponset, and that's why I wrote drawn together over this part of the Venn diagram and Cora Cook's Ponset over that part of the Venn diagram. Now, there's lots of things about those two books that are the same, and that's what I want you to come up with today. I'm going to model today coming up with the contrasts, or things that are different. So, as we've talked about, you can find contrasts about the characters, about their identities. You can find contrasts about the setting, about where the stories happen. You can find contrasts about the problems in the story, or how the problems got solved, or anything else your brain can come up with. I came up with a contrast today about how the problems got solved, because we know that both of them had problems that revolved around connecting with members of your family, but they solved them in different ways. And drawn together, the grandson and the grandfather were able to connect using art. Oops, sorry friends. In Cora Cook's Ponset, Cora and her mom and her grandfather were able to connect using cooking. So those were contrasts, those were different. And so that's what I included in my Venn diagram. For drawn together, I used this little illustration because I was making my contrast about the way the problem got solved. So that's why I did that little illustration. But in drawn together, I wrote, and you can read it with me if you want, ready, set, read, use art to connect. Whereas in Cora Cook's Ponset, you can read it with me if you want, ready, set, read, use cooking to connect. So those are contrasts, things about those two books that are different. Your job today is to come up with a comparison. Things about drawn together in Cora Cook's Ponset, or another book if you chose another book, that are the same, and put that in the center of the Venn diagram. Challenge yourself to come up with more than one, or challenge yourself to come up with more contrasts and add those to the list. Now, remember, you can use any book to complete a Venn diagram that you want. I thought of a couple of other books that were similar to Drawn Together. I thought of Carmela Full of Wishes because she and her brother were having a hard time connecting in this story. That made me think of Drawn Together. I also had a text-to-text connection to The Invisible String because it reminded me about how even if you're frustrated or blue or red with a member of your family, that doesn't stop the invisible string from connecting you together. That made me think about how even when grandson and grandfather were a little bit bored during their visit, that didn't mean they stopped loving each other and being connected by an invisible string. So you could use those instead of Cora Cook's Ponset, or a different book if you want. If you need help coming up with a book to connect to or contrast with, or what comparisons and contrasts to use, feel free to reach out to your teacher. And when you're done, show us your Venn diagram by sending us a picture or recording your voice just to let us know what ideas you came up with.